The scent of cedar filled my workshop like a prayer. Saturday mornings were a sacred time for me. No emails to answer, no calls to return, just the quiet conversation between my hands and a piece of wood. I was running a block of cherry wood over the jointer, the blade shaving off paper-thin curls with a satisfying whir. The grain was revealing itself, a beautiful, complex pattern that had been hiding just beneath the rough surface. In my world, value wasn't something you coded or funded. It was something you uncovered with patience and skill. The low, almost imperceptible hum of an electric motor cut through the morning calm. It was a sound that didn't belong here, among the bird song and the distant rumble of the freight train. I glanced out the window of the detached garage and saw the source. A sleek, graphite-gray Rivian truck, looking like a spaceship that had landed in my very ordinary Fort Worth driveway. My stomach tightened into a familiar knot. It was Kyle. He never drove up from Austin on a weekend unless he wanted something. The driver's side door opened, and my son emerged, not with a knock, but with the quiet click of my front door opening, a sound I heard even over the hum of my tools. He'd always treated this house like his own private property, not a place he needed to be invited into. "Dad? Are you out here smelling sawdust again?" His voice carried a tone of amused condescension, the one he used when he was about to explain something to me as if I were a child. "Seriously, you could automate this whole setup. A CNC machine would do this in a tenth of the time." I hit the kill switch on the jointer, and the sudden silence made his words hang in the air, sharp and out of place. He stood in the doorway of my sanctuary, dressed in what he called stealth wealth, a plain black t-shirt that probably cost $300, designer jeans, and a minimalist watch on his wrist that was worth more than my truck. He looked at my workshop not as a place of creation, but as a problem of inefficiency. I wiped my hands on a rag, buying a moment to study his face. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his jaw was set with a tension that all his success couldn't seem to smooth away. "I like doing things by hand, Kyle. It's the whole point," I said, my voice even. I began sweeping up the wood shavings, the simple, repetitive motion, a comfort against the unease coiling in my gut. "What brings you all the way up here so early?" He walked past me, his expensive sneakers avoiding the sawdust on the floor, and leaned against my workbench. His eyes scanned the tools hanging on the pegboard, the hand-crank drill press, the collection of well-worn chisels. It was the same look a health inspector gives a kitchen he's about to shut down. "It's almost 11, Dad. For people who are actually building things in the world, this is midday." He picked up one of my hand planes, turning it over in his hands with a look of detached curiosity, like an archaeologist examining a primitive artifact. "You still live in the Dark Ages. You don't even have a smart thermostat." The words were a jab, meant to sting. I straightened my back, feeling every one of my 68 years. "My thermostat works just fine, and I'm retired, son. I've earned the right to live in whatever age I want." Kyle let out a short, humorless laugh. "Right, retired. That's exactly the problem." He set the plane down and gestured around the workshop. On the wall behind him was a large, detailed schematic I'd drawn by hand for the grandfather clock I was building, a complex web of gears and weights rendered in precise pencil lines. He glanced at it dismissively. "You spend all your time doodling and making wooden boxes while the world is being rebuilt in code. Don't you ever feel like you've been left behind?" I looked at the drawing, at the intricate mechanics I'd spent weeks designing. To him it was just a doodle. He saw a relic. I saw a legacy of meticulous thought. This man, this stranger wearing my son's face, looked at my life's contentment as evidence of a crime. The peaceful morning light filtering through the dusty workshop window suddenly felt harsh, like an interrogation lamp. My space, the place where I'd taught him how to hold a hammer, how to measure twice and cut once, seemed to shrink under his critical gaze. The smell of cedar, which had felt so comforting just minutes before, now smelled like decay. "Left behind?" I finally answered, my voice quieter than I intended. I turned away from him and ran my hand over the smooth, unfinished surface of the cherry wood. "Kyle, the world you're talking about, it's a race that doesn't have a finish line. You build an app, it's obsolete in 6 months. You secure funding, you immediately need the next round. It's a ghost you can never catch. Here," I tapped the block of wood. "This is real. In 50 years, this clock will still be ticking. It will still be marking time, long after my time is up. That's not being left behind. That's creating something that lasts." I looked him in the eye, trying to will him to understand. There's a difference between a legacy and a balance sheet. He just shook his head, a small, pitying smile on his face. It was the kind of expression you'd give a dog that couldn't learn a new trick. See, that's your problem right there. You think in terms of one. One clock, one house, one life. I think in terms of millions. Scalability, impact. The things I'm building are going to change the way millions of people live their lives. Your clock is going to tell time for, what, a handful of your descendants? It's a rounding error, Dad. It's sentimental nonsense. He started pacing now, the nervous energy radiating off him, filling my quiet workshop with a frantic buzz. He was a hornet in a jar, bumping against the glass of a world he couldn't comprehend. I get it, he continued, holding his hands up in a gesture of mock surrender. You're happy, you're content. But did you ever stop to think that your contentment came at a price, that it limited my potential? The question was so out of left field, so monumentally selfish, that I could only stare at him, my mouth slightly agape. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine as I realized this wasn't just a casual visit. This was an indictment. He'd come here to put my entire life on trial. What are you talking about? My voice was barely a whisper. I'm talking about example, Dad. I'm talking about network. I had to go to networking events and hand out business cards like some nobody off the street. Do you know how many of my colleagues in Austin got their seed money from their fathers? How many of them got their first big client because their dad played golf with the right CEO? He stopped pacing and pointed a finger at me, his voice rising with a resentment that sounded years old. You played with wood. You fixed leaky faucets. You taught me how to change a tire. You never taught me how to build an empire, because you never had the ambition to build one for yourself. The words hit me like a physical blow. I had to steady myself against the workbench, the rough edge of the plywood biting into my palm. My mind was reeling, flashing through a slideshow of memories. Me sitting at the kitchen table with a 7-year-old Kyle, patiently explaining binary code with pennies and dimes because he was curious about how computers thought. Me, cashing in stock options from the Helios acquisition money. I'd told his mother we'd save for our old age to pay for his tuition at Carnegie Mellon, one of the best computer science schools in the country. Me, co-signing the lease on his first office, a tiny, windowless room he couldn't have afforded without my credit backing him. I had given him the foundation, the tools, the education, and he stood here now telling me I'd given him nothing. I looked down at my hands. The knuckles were swollen from arthritis, the skin cross-hatched with tiny scars from slipped chisels and saw blades. These hands had built his first bookshelf, repaired his first car, and, in a life he knew nothing about, they had typed the thousands of lines of code that became the bedrock of modern computing. And he was ashamed of them. He was ashamed of me because I didn't play golf with CEOs. The sheer, staggering ingratitude of it all left me breathless. It was a betrayal so profound it felt like it was rewriting the past, turning every sacrifice I'd ever made into a source of his personal shame. He took my silence as agreement, as a confession of my guilt. His voice softened, but it was the calculated, condescending softness of a closing argument. Look, I made it anyway. I clawed my way into the rooms you never knew existed, but it would have been easier if my own father had shown me the map. Instead, you gave me a compass that only pointed to this workshop, to a life of mediocrity. He gestured around the room again, at the tools, the wood, the half-finished projects. He wasn't just looking at my hobby anymore. He was looking at my entire existence, at the sum of my 68 years on this earth, and finding it utterly worthless. You've built a life of nothing, he said, the final words delivered with a quiet, surgical precision. A legacy of nothing. A legacy of nothing. The words echoed in the sudden stillness of my workshop, stripping the air of its warmth, of its familiar comfort. For a long moment I didn't move. I just stood there, looking at the son I had raised, at the child whose every scraped knee I had cleaned, and whose every success I had celebrated, and I saw a complete stranger. The deep, aching hurt that had filled my chest began to change, crystallizing into something hard and clear, something I hadn't felt in decades. It was a cold, quiet anger, the kind that doesn't shout, but that changes the temperature of a room. All the patience, all the gentle understanding I had tried to give him over the years had been mistaken for weakness, and that mistake was about to be corrected. I slowly placed the block of wood I was holding onto the workbench, the sound a dull, final thud in the silence. I met his gaze, and for the first time he didn't see the accommodating, gentle father he was used to. I think he saw the man I used to be, the one who led teams and made decisions that affected millions. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face before the mask of arrogance slammed back into place. "This workshop," I began, my voice low and steady, a strange calm settling over me. "This house, the education you received, the capital I gave you to start your first company. You seem to be under the impression that these things are your birthright. You believe you are entitled to them, and to more. You are mistaken." I took a step toward him, and he instinctively took a step back, out of my space. "I gave you every advantage I could. Not a network of shallow connections, but a foundation of character. I taught you the value of a promise, the importance of integrity, the dignity of a day's hard work. That was the legacy I tried to give you. And you stand here, in the very home built on that foundation, and you spit on it. You have squandered the only inheritance that truly matters." I didn't wait for him to respond. I walked past him, out of the workshop and across the small yard to the back door of my house. I opened it wide, the old screen door groaning in protest. I stood there, holding it open, waiting. He followed me out, his face a mixture of confusion and indignation, as if he couldn't process what was happening. He was a programmer who had encountered a line of code he couldn't parse. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice regaining some of its bluster. "Are you kicking me out? After I drove all the way up here to have a serious conversation?" "We're done talking," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. "This is my house. It is a place of respect. You have shown it, and me none, so you will leave." "This is unbelievable," he sputtered, shaking his head. "You're the one who's achieved nothing, and you're kicking me out?" The last of my patience evaporated. "Get out," I said, the words like chips of ice. "And you will not come back. Not until you understand the difference between the cost of something and its value. Not until you can look at the life your mother and I built for you and feel a flicker of gratitude instead of this bottomless, arrogant contempt. I don't know the man standing in front of me, but I miss my son. You can return when you find him. Lem." For a second he looked like he might argue, that he might push past me and escalate this fight into something uglier. But something in my eyes stopped him. He saw a line drawn, a border he would not be allowed to cross. With a final, disgusted sneer, he turned on his heel and stalked toward his silent, expensive truck. He got in without looking back, the door closing with a soft, solid thud. The engine hummed to life, and he backed out of my driveway with an unnecessary burst of speed, kicking up gravel from the shoulder. I stood in the doorway, the screen door still held open, and watched until the truck disappeared down the street. The Saturday morning quiet rushed back in to fill the void, but it was different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, empty, and charged with the ghosts of words that could never be unsaid. The anger drained out of me as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a vast, hollow ache. I had just thrown my only child out of my life, and I had never felt more alone. I finally let the screen door swing shut, the slap of wood against the frame echoing the finality of what I'd just done. The house was quiet. It was always quiet on Saturdays, but this was a different kind of silence. It was heavy, accusatory. Kyle's words had soaked into the very walls, and now they were whispering back at me from every corner. A legacy of nothing, wasted potential, mediocrity. I walked into the living room and sank into my old leather armchair, the one my late wife, Helen, had always called my thinking chair. Today, thinking was the last thing I wanted to do. My gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, to the gallery of framed photographs that chronicled our family's life. There was one of Helen and me on our wedding day, young and impossibly optimistic. There was another of me holding Kyle as a newborn, his tiny hand wrapped around my index finger. My eyes settled on the largest photo. Kyle on his graduation day from Carnegie Mellon, his arms slung around my shoulders, both of us beaming with pride. In that moment he hadn't seen me as a failure. He'd seen me as the father who had worked tirelessly to get him to that stage. Or had he? Had the contempt been there all along, hiding behind the smile? Was I a fool for never seeing it? "What did I do wrong, Helen?" I whispered to a photo of her, taken on a trip to the Grand Canyon a few years before she passed. She was smiling, her eyes full of the kindness that had been the anchor of my life. I tried to teach him that character was more important than a career. I wanted him to be a good man, not just a rich one. Did I fail? Did I make him this way? The smiling woman in the frame offered no answers. The silence in the room deepened, becoming a vast, empty space where my son's love used to be. The righteous anger that had given me the strength to send him away was gone now, washed out by a cold tide of doubt. Maybe he was right. Maybe my quiet life was a mistake. I had chosen a path of simplicity, of anonymity, believing it was the noble choice, the right choice for raising a son. I had deliberately hidden my past, the world of frantic innovation and dizzying success I'd been a part of. I didn't want him growing up in the shadow of a famous father, defined by my accomplishments instead of forging his own. But in trying to give him a normal life, had I accidentally given him a reason to despise me? Had my humility, the very principle I'd tried to instill in him, created this gaping hole of ambition in him that he now resented me for? I pushed myself out of the chair and walked back to the workshop, drawn to the scene of the confrontation. The air was still thick with tension. The tools on the wall looked like museum exhibits. The half-finished clock seemed to mock me with its silent, motionless hands. I picked up the schematic he'd called a doodle. My hand was steady as I traced the intricate lines, the careful calculations, the elegant mechanics of the escapement wheel. It was a complex system, a language of logic and precision. It was the same kind of thinking, the same part of my brain, that had designed the core architecture of the Helios operating system. And my own son, a man who worshipped at the altar of technology, had looked at this evidence of pure, analog code and seen nothing of value. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. For hours I drifted through the house like a ghost, the silence amplifying every self-critical thought. I tried to read the newspaper, but the words blurred together. I made a cup of coffee, but it tasted like ash. The loneliness was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest. It wasn't just that Kyle was gone. It was the feeling of being fundamentally and completely misunderstood by the one person I thought I had created in my own image of integrity. The foundation of my life, my identity as a father, had been fractured, and I was terrified that it couldn't be repaired. I couldn't carry this alone. I needed someone to talk to who knew the whole story. Not just the story of Art Donovan, the retired woodworker, but the story of the man I was before. There was only one person left who did. My hand trembled slightly as I picked up my old flip phone from the kitchen counter, another relic. Kyle loved to mock and scrolled through the contacts. The list was short. I stopped at the name Leo Martinez, my friend, my former colleague from the old days, my co-conspirator in this long, quiet retirement. My finger hovered over the call button. I hadn't spoken to him in months, but I needed to know if I was a fool. I needed to hear another voice tell me that my life hadn't been a waste. I took a deep breath and pressed the button. The phone rang twice before a familiar, gravelly voice answered. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. Art Donovan. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten how to use that fossil you call a phone." "Leo," I said, and just speaking his name felt like a small weight had lifted. My voice was rough, with unshed emotion. I need to talk." There was a pause on the other end, and the joking tone in his voice vanished, replaced by the sharp perception of a man who had known me for nearly 50 years. "It's Kyle, isn't it?" he asked, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Where are you?" "I'm at home." "No, you're not. You're in your head. Meet me at Dolly's." 20 minutes, he said, and the line went dead. He didn't need to ask for details. He knew a crisis when he heard one. Dolly's Diner was a relic from another time, a place where the coffee was strong, the bacon was crisp, and the vinyl on the booths was cracked like old leather. It was our place, a neutral ground where we'd been dissecting life's problems since we were young men with more ambition than sense. Leo was already in our usual booth by the window when I walked in, a half-empty mug in his hands. He still had the same sharp, intelligent eyes, though they were now framed by a web of wrinkles. He looked at me as I slid into the booth opposite him, his gaze taking in my slumped shoulders and the exhaustion on my face. "That bad, huh?" he said quietly. The waitress came over and set a mug of black coffee in front of me without me having to ask. And then it all came pouring out. I told him everything. The unannounced visit, the condescending remarks about my workshop, the way he dismissed my life's work as sentimental nonsense. I recounted his bitter monologue about my failure to provide him a network, my failure to be someone important. My voice cracked when I repeated his final judgment, the words still feeling like shards of glass in my throat. He said I'd built a legacy of nothing, Leo. Nothing. I told him how I'd thrown him out, how I'd laid down an ultimatum I wasn't sure I had the strength to enforce. And now, I finished, staring down into my coffee cup. I've been sitting in that empty house all day wondering if he's right. We chose this quiet life. We walked away from it all. But did I make a mistake? By trying to teach him humility, did I just end up making him resent me for it? Leo was silent for a long moment, slowly turning his coffee mug in his hands. He wasn't the type to offer easy platitudes. He was a systems analyst at heart. He listened to all the data before identifying the root cause of the problem. "Let me get this straight," he finally said, his voice a low rumble. "Your son, who lives in a luxury apartment paid for by a business you helped him start, who drives a car that costs more than my first house, and who has a world-class education that you funded, stood in your home and told you that you'd given him nothing?" I just nodded, feeling the shame of it all over again. "Then you didn't just do the right thing by throwing him out," Leo said, leaning forward, his eyes intense. "You did the only thing. You're his father, Art. Your job isn't to make him comfortable, especially when he's comfortably spouting nonsense. Your job is to teach him. And it sounds like his education is long overdue." He took a sip of his coffee. "You and I, we saw the belly of the beast. We were there in the early days, building that world he worships. We saw what it did to people. The burnout, the greed, the golden handcuffs. We cashed out, my friend. Not just for the money, but for our souls. We chose to live authentic lives. Don't you dare let him reframe that choice as a failure." His words were like a bracing wind, clearing away the fog of my self-doubt. He saw it so clearly. "The kid's running on corrupted code, Art," he continued, and a wry smile touched his lips as he fell back on our old language. "Full of bugs and vanity loops, all running on a faulty operating system called entitlement. You just forced a hard reboot. It's a shock to the system, and it's supposed to be. Now you have to wait and see if the original programming, the good stuff you installed 30 years ago, is still in there." He reached across the table and gripped my shoulder. His hand was warm and steady. "What if it's not?" I asked, the fear still lingering. "What if I lost him for good?" "You didn't lose your son," Leo said firmly. "You lost your patience with the arrogant brat who was wearing his face. Now you have to give your son, the real Kyle, the time and the space to find his way back. And he has to do it on his own." He leaned back, his point made. The certainty in his voice was contagious. I felt the resilience flowing back into me, the rightness of my decision solidifying in my gut. It still hurt. It hurt like hell. But it wasn't the confusing, disorienting pain of doubt anymore. It was the clean, sharp pain of a necessary surgery. So I just... wait? "You wait," Leo confirmed. He signaled the waitress for the check. "You live your life. You go back into that workshop and you finish that beautiful clock. You show him, and more importantly yourself, what a real legacy looks like. And Art," he looked me dead in the eye, "you hold the line. Don't you dare call him first." I left Dolly's diner with Leo's words echoing in my head. Hold the line. It felt less like a piece of advice and more like a command, a strategic directive from an old general who knew the terrain better than I did. I drove home not with a light heart but with a settled one. The course was set. The pain was still there, a dull throb beneath my ribs, but the confusion was gone, and in its place was a quiet, firm resolve. That afternoon I went back into my workshop, and for the first time since Kyle's visit it felt like my sanctuary again. I looked at the schematic for the grandfather clock, not as a doodle but as a blueprint for my own resilience. I picked up my tools and I got to work. The first few days were fueled by that renewed certainty. Every cut of the saw, every pass of the handplane was an affirmation of my values. Craftsmanship, I thought as I carefully carved a dovetail joint, is the opposite of my son's world. It cannot be hacked or accelerated. It demands patience, rewards precision, and has no tolerance for shortcuts. It was a form of meditation, a way to channel my emotional turmoil into the creation of something ordered and beautiful. The workshop became my monastery, and the steady rhythm of my work was a prayer for my son's return to sense. But as the first week bled into the second, the silence began to test my resolve. Every time my flip phone buzzed on the workbench, my heart would leap into my throat. a ridiculous jolt of hope that would instantly curdle into disappointment when I saw it was just a severe weather alert or a spam call. More than once, I found myself scrolling to Kyle's name in my contacts, my thumb hovering over the call button. The urge to just fix it, to smooth things over like I had done 1,000 times when he was a boy, was a powerful physical pull. In those moments, I would force myself to put the phone down and pick up a piece of sandpaper. I would sand a rough sawn board by hand, back and forth, until the grain was as smooth as silk and the temptation had passed. I was wearing down my own weakness, one stroke at a time. My neighbor Jerry caught me at the fence one afternoon while I was weeding the garden. "Heard from that high-flying son of yours?" he asked, his voice full of genuine, folksy curiosity. "Still setting the world on fire down there in Austin?" I forced a smile, the words feeling like a lie in my mouth. "Always," I said. "You know, Kyle, he's busy building his empire." The irony was so thick I could taste it. My son was busy trying to build an empire on a foundation of debt and disrespect, and he didn't even know it. By the end of the second week, something inside me had shifted. The constant battle with temptation had subsided. The raw anger had faded, and the sharp edges of the pain had been worn smooth by the steady abrasion of time. What remained was a profound sadness, a deep and quiet grief for the relationship I thought I had. But beneath it all was a bedrock of peace. I had accepted the silence. I had made my stand not out of pride, but out of principle, the last, most difficult principle of fatherhood. I couldn't force my son to respect me. I could only be a man worthy of respect. That Friday night I was in the workshop, working late. The main cabinet of the clock was assembled, and I was fitting the first of the wooden gears into the intricate timekeeping movement. It was a delicate operation, requiring a steady hand and absolute focus. I held my breath, nudging the gear into place until, with a soft, satisfying click, it meshed perfectly with its partner. I stepped back and looked at the complex, beautiful machine beginning to take shape. It was a legacy, not a legacy of nothing, but a legacy of patience, of skill, of quiet dedication. A legacy of time and the honor of spending it well. The house was dark, the street was quiet, and my phone on the workbench remained silent. I was holding the line, and for the first time in 2 weeks, the waiting felt like a kind of strength. It was a Monday evening, nearly 3 weeks after the confrontation. The initial, sharp pain of the schism had settled into a chronic, low-grade ache. I was in my armchair reading a book on celestial navigation, a hobby that, like woodworking, appealed to my sense of order and tangible truths. The house was quiet. I had accepted the quiet. I had made my peace with the waiting. And then the doorbell rang. The sound was so unexpected it made me jolt. It wasn't a package delivery, and it was too late for a neighbor to drop by. My heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. I set my book down, my mind racing. "Hold the line," Leo had said. I walked to the door, my footsteps measured, my expression carefully neutral. I looked through the peephole, and my breath caught in my chest. It was Kyle. He was just standing there on my porch, his hands in his pockets, looking not at his phone, but at my front door, as if gathering the courage to have knocked it all. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door. The man on my porch was different from the one who had stormed out of my driveway 3 weeks ago. His expensive clothes were slightly rumpled, his shoulders were slumped, and the arrogant tension in his jaw was gone, replaced by a deep, visible exhaustion. He looked up and met my eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the little boy I had raised, the one who knew he had done something wrong and had come to confess. "Dad," he started, his voice quiet, almost hoarse. Can I talk to you for a minute?" I didn't answer right away. I just studied his face, searching for the telltale signs of a performance. But his eyes were clear, and they held a shame that looked achingly real. I stepped aside and gestured for him to come in. He walked into the living room and stood awkwardly in the center of the rug, as if he knew he no longer had the right to make himself comfortable in this house. I closed the door and turned to face him, crossing my arms, waiting. "I don't know where to start," he said, his gaze dropping to the floor. "What I did, what I said to you in the workshop, there's no excuse for it. It was cruel, and it was wrong, and it wasn't true." He looked up at me then, and his eyes were glistening. "My whole life, You've been nothing but a good father to me. You supported me. You believed in me, even when I was just a kid with a crazy idea, and I repaid you with that. I've been under a lot of pressure with my company, and I've been letting it twist me into someone I don't recognize. I took it all out on you, and I am so, so sorry, Dad. I'm ashamed of myself." Every word was a balm on the raw wound in my heart. It was everything I had hoped to hear, everything I had waited for. The cautious, guarded part of my mind, the part that had been reinforced by Leo, was still there, searching for the angle, the catch. But the father in me, the part that had been grieving for 3 weeks, wanted desperately to believe it. "I accept your apology, Kyle," I said, my voice thick with emotion I hadn't realized was so close to the surface. A visible wave of relief washed over him. He took a hesitant step forward. "Thank you," he whispered. "I want to make it up to you. I want to try and bridge this gap between our worlds." He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled something out. It was a sleek black laminate card attached to a lanyard. He held it out to me. "This is for you." I took it from him. The card was heavy, made of some kind of brushed metal. In holographic silver lettering, it read, "InnovateX 2025. VIP Innovator Pass." "It's the big tech summit in Austin this weekend," he explained, his voice full of a new, nervous energy. "It's my whole world, all in one place, and I want you to come. I want you to see what I do, to understand the world I live in. Not the version you see when I'm being an arrogant jerk, but the part that I'm actually passionate about." He looked at me, his expression pleading. "I want you to see me, and I want you to be there with me. Maybe you can help me remember what's really important, outside of all that noise." The offer, the way he framed it, was a stroke of genius. It wasn't a boast, it was an invitation. It wasn't a demand, it was a request for my guidance. He was offering me the very thing he'd accused me of never providing, a place in his world. He was making me feel needed again. The last of my caution dissolved, replaced by a surging, powerful hope. This was it. This was the breakthrough. I looked down at the VIP pass in my hand. It felt like a key, a promise of a new beginning. I looked back at my son, who was watching me with a hopeful, open expression. "I'd like that very much, Kyle," I said, and the smile that spread across his face was like the sun coming out after a long, bitter storm. "I'll be there." The tension in the room dissolved completely, replaced by a warm, unfamiliar lightness. Kyle's shoulders, which had been hunched with anxiety, finally relaxed. That's great, Dad." "Really great," he said, a genuine, unburdened smile spreading across his face. "I'll pick you up Friday afternoon. The main events are on Saturday. Just pack a couple of things. It's pretty casual, but, you know, Austin." He gave a small, self-deprecating shrug, and in that moment he was just my son again. We talked for a few more minutes about the logistics, the easy, mundane details feeling like a miracle after 3 weeks of charged silence. When he got to the door to leave, he paused and turned back. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice soft. "Thanks for not giving up on me." He stepped forward and gave me a brief, slightly awkward hug. It wasn't much, but it felt like the rebuilding of a bridge I thought had been burned to the ground. I hugged him back, clapping him on the shoulder, my heart feeling too big for my chest. "Never," I whispered. After he left, I stood in the living room for a long time, just holding the VIP pass. It was cool and heavy in my hand, a solid, tangible object that proved the nightmare was over. The silence that filled the house now was peaceful, a welcome quiet after the storm. I walked over to the mantelpiece and looked at the photo of Helen. "He came back," I told her, a joyful tear tracing a path down my cheek. Our boy came back. The doubt and loneliness that had been my constant companions for weeks had evaporated, leaving behind a clean, bright optimism. My son hadn't just apologized. He had asked for my help, for my presence in his world. He wanted his father. My first impulse was to share the news. I needed to tell Leo. He had been my rock, the one who had bolstered my resolve, and he deserved to hear that his faith in my son and in me had been justified. I grabbed my phone and dialed his number, pacing around the living room with an energy I hadn't felt in years. "Talk to me," Leo's voice answered, gruff as always. "He came back, Leo." The words tumbled out of me in a rush of excitement. Kyle was just here. He apologized for everything. He was humble. He was sincere. It was everything we hoped for. I could hear the smile in Leo's voice. Well, I'll be. That's wonderful news, Art. Truly. I'm glad to hear it. Knew the kid had it in him somewhere. That's not even the best part, I continued, unable to contain my excitement. He invited me to that big InnovateX summit in Austin this weekend. Gave me a VIP pass and everything. He said he wants me to see his world, to be a part of it. He wants my perspective, Leo. My guidance. There was a short pause on the other end. It wasn't a bad pause, just a thoughtful one. A big tech summit, huh? Leo said slowly. That's quite a gesture. A full one. 80 from calling your life's work a doodle. I know. Isn't it incredible? I said, completely swept up in the moment. It's his way of making things right, of showing me I matter to him. Oh, I'm sure it is, Leo said, and his tone was warm, but I could detect a subtle undercurrent of something else. Caution, maybe. It's just a pretty quick turnaround from where he was a few weeks ago to this. People don't normally rewrite their whole operating system that fast. Just keep your eyes open, my friend. Enjoy it, but keep your eyes open. I waved his concern away, my good mood too buoyant to be sunk by his skepticism. I know what you're thinking, you old cynic. But you didn't see him. This was real. I could feel it. This is our second chance, Leo. I hope you're right, Art. For your sake, I really do, he said, and I knew he meant it. After we hung up, I walked into my bedroom and pulled a small overnight bag from the top of the closet. I started packing, a wide, genuine smile on my face. I picked out one of my newer button-down shirts, taking a moment to iron it, something I hadn't done in years. I felt a lightness in my step, a sense of purpose that had been missing for weeks. My son wanted me. He needed me. As I packed my bag, I hummed an old tune, the house filled not with silence, but with the quiet, joyful music of a father's hope. The drive from Fort Worth to Austin on Friday was pleasant enough. For the first time in years, the conversation between us didn't feel like navigating a minefield. I told him about the progress on my grandfather clock, and he actually seemed to listen, asking a few questions about the type of wood I was using. He talked about his company, but he kept it simple, avoiding the jargon I didn't understand. He was making an effort. My heart swelled with a quiet, joyful hope. This was working. We were rebuilding. The next morning, however, as we drove toward the Austin Convention Center, I felt a subtle shift in him. The easygoing son from yesterday was gone, replaced by a tense, coiled version I recognized from his most stressful college exams. His eyes, which had met mine so freely the day before, were now darting constantly to the phone mounted on his dashboard. His thumbs tapped out frantic, staccato messages. "Big day, huh?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "The biggest," he mumbled, his eyes locked on the screen. "Everything's riding on today." I chose to interpret his tension as excitement, as the nervous energy of a man who was passionate about his work and wanted to make his old man proud. I was his guest, here to see his world, and I was determined to see the best in it. Then we arrived, and his world hit me like a physical force. The convention center was less a building and more a monument of glass and steel, with massive digital banners flashing the logos of tech giants. The air thrummed with a low electronic bass beat that seemed to vibrate in my bones. We were swept inside on a river of people, thousands of them, mostly young, all moving with a frantic, purposeful energy. They wore identical uniforms of expensive hoodies, designer sneakers, and the same hungry, ambitious look in their eyes. It was a sea of people, yet no one seemed to be talking to the person next to them. They were all staring down at their phones, their faces illuminated by the pale blue light of their screens, networking with people who weren't there. I felt like I was an archaeologist who had stumbled into a thriving alien civilization. The language was foreign, a constant buzz of words like synergy, monetization, blockchain, disruptive innovation. I was wearing my freshly ironed button-down shirt and a pair of comfortable loafers, and I had never felt more out of place in my life. I was an analog man in a digital world, a relic in a museum of the future, and a profound sense of disorientation began to set in. Kyle navigated the chaos with a grim determination, his VIP pass acting like a key to a secret kingdom. We bypassed long, snaking lines, our lanyards granting us access to areas roped off from the general crowd. But Kyle didn't seem to be enjoying his status. He was a bundle of raw nerves, his head on a constant swivel, scanning the faces in the crowd. It wasn't the look of someone searching for a friend, but the furtive, anxious look of a man trying to spot a predator or perhaps avoid a creditor. He barely spoke to me, offering only clipped, distracted answers to my questions. Look at that, a 3D printed prosthetic hand, I said, pointing to an incredible display. Yeah, cool, he muttered, his eyes glued to his phone as he typed another frantic message. My initial optimism began to flicker. Leo's words echoed in my mind. Keep your eyes open. But I pushed the doubt away. This was his Super Bowl. Of course, he was stressed. He was trying to land the next big deal, to secure his future, and he had invited me here to witness it. My job was to be a supportive father, not a suspicious critic. I would not let my discomfort color this important day for him. He led me toward a large, glass-walled enclosure with a sign that read, Innovators Lounge, VIP, access only. The thumping music was slightly more subdued in here, but the energy was even more intense. This was where the real players were, the venture capitalists with billion-dollar funds and the founders of companies whose names I only vaguely recognized from the news. Kyle stopped just inside the entrance, taking a deep, shaky breath. He scanned the room, and for a split second, his eyes landed on a group of older men in expensive suits in the far corner. A flicker of pure, undiluted panic crossed his face before he managed to smother it with a brittle smile. He turned to me, the smile not quite reaching his eyes. They were wide with an emotion I couldn't place. It looked a lot like fear. Okay, Dad, he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too bright. Let's grab a drink. There's someone I need you to meet. I followed Kyle through the crowded lounge to a small, semi-private alcove in the back, furnished with 2 sleek leather chairs and a low glass table. The thumping bass of the music was duller here, but the frantic energy of the summit still seeped in, a constant, high-frequency hum just beneath the surface. Kyle didn't sit. He just stood there, running a hand through his hair, his eyes darting toward the group of men in suits across the room. So, I said, trying to break the tense silence, who is this person you need me to meet? An investor? The investors, he corrected, his voice tight. The final round. The big one. He started pacing the small space, his movements sharp and agitated. Look, Dad, the reason I brought you here, it's not just so you could see all this. He gestured vaguely at the lounge, at the tech world swirling around us. It's because I'm on the edge of something huge, the biggest opportunity of my life, but I need your help to get it across the finish line. I sat down in one of the chairs, a knot of confusion and a new, colder unease forming in my stomach. Leo's voice was a faint whisper in the back of my mind. Keep your eyes open. My help? I asked. Son, what could I possibly do to help in a world like this? I don't speak the language. You don't have to, he said, stopping his pacing to face me. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with a desperate, almost feral intensity. The mask of the calm, successful founder was gone, and in its place was a man on the ragged edge of a cliff. You just have to be you. He took a deep breath, and then the words came out in a torrent, a confession he could no longer hold back. The company, it's not doing well, Dad. We're almost out of cash. We've been running on fumes for 6 months. This summit, this funding round, it's not for expansion, it's a lifeline. Without it, we're finished. I lose everything. The confession hit me, but I didn't have time to process it before he continued, the words tumbling over one another. Those men over there, he glanced toward the suits, they're the venture fund. They're ready to sign. $2 million. But there's a catch. They see me as a risk. They said my assets are too tied up, too volatile. They'll only approve the loan if I have a co-signer. Someone stable. Someone with a lifetime of assets, a perfect credit history, and a portfolio that screams security. He finally looked at me, and in that moment, I saw the true purpose of this entire charade reflected in his desperate eyes. The last 3 weeks, the apology, the hug, the VIP pass, the glimmer of hope, it all collapsed in on itself with a sickening, silent implosion. It was a lie. All of it. A carefully constructed stage play designed to lead to this exact moment in this room. I wasn't here as his father. I was here as his collateral. Dad, he said, his voice dropping to a desperate plea, I need you to co-sign the loan. The shock was so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I couldn't speak. I could only stare at him, my mind frantically replaying every moment, every word, every gesture, now all tainted with the poison of this revelation. The dawning horror was a cold, creeping thing, wrapping itself around my heart. He hadn't come back for me. He had come back for my signature. He had looked at the ruin of our relationship and seen it not as a tragedy to be mended, but as an obstacle to be manipulated. "Kyle," I finally managed to say, my voice a hollow rasp. I can't do that." "What? Why not?" he asked, a sharp edge of panic in his voice. "Because I don't have that kind of money. You know that," I said, my own voice rising with disbelief. "Where do you think I have millions of dollars stashed away? I'm a retired woodworker. I live on a pension and my Social Security. My house is paid off, and that's it. That's everything." He just stared at me, his expression shifting from desperation to a stunning, absolute incomprehension, as if I just started speaking a foreign language. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No, that can't be right. You worked for 40 years. All those side jobs, the overtime. I told them you were, the quiet type. Old money. That you had a substantial nest egg from a lifetime of careful, smart work. I told them you were ready to back me." He had built his lie on a foundation of his own assumptions, on a lifetime of refusing to see the truth of my simple, frugal life. And now he expected me to make his lie a reality. "The house, then," he said, his voice cracking. "We can leverage the house. It has to be worth enough to secure the note." And there it was. The final, horrifying piece of the puzzle. He wasn't just asking for money I didn't have. He was asking me to risk the only thing I had left. My home. The place where I had raised him. The place where Helen and I had built our life. The very symbol of my legacy of nothing that he so despised. He was willing to burn it all down to fuel the dying embers of his ambition. I looked at my son, at the stranger standing before me, and the last of my hope turned to ash in my mouth. I stared at my son, at the frantic, desperate stranger who was asking me to gamble my home, my security, my entire life on his failing dream. The last ember of hope inside me died, leaving behind nothing but the cold, hard ash of the truth. This was not a reconciliation. This was a hostile takeover. I slowly pushed myself to my feet, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. My voice, when it came, was devoid of anger. It was just tired, empty. "No," I said, the single word cutting through his frantic energy. "The answer is no, Kyle. I will not sign your loan. I will not give you my house. This conversation is over." I turned to walk away, to leave this glass-walled cage of his ambition, and find my way back to a world that made sense. "Over?" he shrieked, his voice cracking with disbelief and rage. He lunged and grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "It's not over. You don't get to walk away. I brought you here for a reason." His shout was so sharp, so raw, that it sliced through the curated buzz of the lounge. Heads began to turn. Conversations faltered. The professionals, the innovators, the venture capitalists, they all smelled blood in the water. A few phones were discreetly raised, their small red recording lights winking on like predatory eyes in the dark. I tried to pull my arm away, but his grip was like iron. The shame was a hot flush crawling up my neck. My most private, painful family moment was becoming a public spectacle. "You are a selfish old man," he screamed, his face contorted into a mask of pure fury. All the carefully constructed composure was gone, burned away by the acid of his failure. "You've been sitting on it your whole life, haven't you? Hiding it away, pretending to be some humble saint while you let your own son struggle. You'd rather let me fail than lift a single finger to help." "That's not true," I said, my voice low, trying desperately not to engage, not to feed the fire. But he was past listening. He was performing now, playing to the new audience he had gathered. "Isn't it?" he laughed, a bitter, ugly sound. "You've never taken a real risk in your life. You talk about legacies. You have no idea what it takes to build one. It takes guts. It takes capital. It takes everything you're too small and too scared to have. This is your fault, all of it. If you had been a real father, a man with real ambition, I wouldn't be in this position." I saw it then, out of the corner of my eye. A camera operator, one of the event staff tasked with capturing candid moments for the live feed, was moving our way, his lens trained directly on us. My blood ran cold. This was no longer just a scene in a VIP lounge. "Kyle, stop!" I pleaded, my voice barely a whisper. "Not here." But my plea was like a gust of wind on a raging inferno. It only made it burn hotter. He saw the camera, and some final, self-destructive switch flipped in his brain. He wanted to burn it all down, and he wanted to take me with him. He let go of my arm and spun toward the low table between the chairs. On it sat several cans of a trendy neon green energy drink called Momentum. He snatched one up, his hand shaking with rage. "You want to talk about legacies?" he snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "My legacy is that I had to climb out of the hole that your mediocrity dug for me. You are a black hole of resources. My whole life you've just soaked up time, money, and energy, and you've given nothing back." And then, in a final, explosive act of desecration, he shook the can violently and threw its contents at me. The spray hit me square in the chest. The shock of it was immense, the icy cold, the sickly sweet smell, the sticky liquid instantly soaking through my clean, ironed shirt and dripping down onto my slacks. I stumbled backward, gasping, my mind unable to process the sheer, childish violence of the act. And as I stood there, dripping and stunned, I heard a collective gasp from the main hall, a sound that rippled through the convention center. I looked up toward the lounge's glass wall and saw it. On the massive 20-foot-high screens flanking the main stage, my own face was projected in crystal-clear high definition, my shocked, humiliated, dripping face. The camera had caught everything, the shouting, the accusation, and the final, pathetic act of assault. A murmur spread through the thousands of attendees, quickly followed by scattered pockets of derisive, mocking laughter. I was frozen, trapped in the glare of 1,000 eyes, 1,000 phones, 1,000 smirking faces. The shame was a physical thing, a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. I was no longer a father in a private argument with his son. I was a meme, a joke, a public spectacle of failure, broadcast for the entertainment of the very world my son idolized. Kyle stood before me, panting, his chest heaving, his face a mask of triumphant rage. He had finally done it. He had proven to everyone, on the biggest stage imaginable, what a complete and utter nothing his father truly was. And I just stood there, soaked in his contempt, my world shrinking to a single, unbearable point of humiliation. I stood frozen in the harsh glare of the lights, a solitary island in a sea of pointing fingers and mocking laughter. The sticky sweet energy drink dripped from my chin onto the floor, each drop a fresh wave of shame. My son stood before me, his chest heaving, his face flushed with the ugly triumph of having finally, publicly, broken me. On the giant screen, my own face stared back, a mask of stunned disbelief and utter humiliation. This was it, the absolute bottom, the legacy my son had created for me, a public punchline. On the main stage, the keynote speaker, a revered industry icon named Julian Croft, a man whose early work I had actually competed against, had faltered mid-sentence. He was a titan, a co-founder of one of the world's largest software companies, and he was known for his unflappable, commanding presence. He noticed the crowd's attention had been stolen, and he turned to see what had captured them. He saw my face on the screen behind him, saw the chaos in the VIP lounge. An annoyed frown creased his brow. "What is all this?" he began, his voice carrying an edge of irritation. But then he stopped. He squinted at the screen, looking past the dripping green liquid, past the rumpled shirt, and focused on my face. The crowd's laughter was reaching a crescendo, a cruel, rolling wave of mockery. Julian Croft's expression shifted. The annoyance melted away, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then a jolt of disbelief, and finally a look of profound, earth-shattering recognition. He leaned forward, his mouth close to the microphone, and his voice boomed through the auditorium, a thunderclap that instantly silenced the room. "Stop," he commanded. "Everyone be quiet now." The authority in his voice was absolute. The laughter died in 1,000 throats, replaced by a confused, expectant hush. The camera operator in the lounge froze, keeping the lens trained on my face. Julian Croft's own face was now projected on the screen next to mine. He was staring at my image as if he were seeing a ghost. "Hold on," he said, his voice now a murmur of awe that was carried to every corner of the massive hall. "I know that man." The silence that followed was total. You could hear the hum of the servers, the whisper of the air conditioning. Every eye was locked on the stage. My son, Kyle, stood paralyzed, his rage draining away to be replaced by a sudden, stark confusion. Julian Croft turned from the screen to face the audience of thousands, his expression one I never thought I'd see again in my life. It was reverence. For those of you under the age of 40, he began, his voice shaking with a strange, excited energy, you probably don't know that name, but you should. You are sitting in this room, you are holding your smartphones, you are running your startups on cloud servers because of the work that man did 30 years ago. He pointed a trembling finger at my image on the screen. My God, he breathed. That's Art Donovan. A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. The name meant nothing to them. But to the older engineers, the gray-haired venture capitalists, the pioneers scattered throughout the room, the name was an electric shock. I saw phones light up everywhere as 1,000 people started frantically searching for a name the world had forgotten. Kyle's mouth fell open. He stared at me, then at the screen, then back at me. His face, which had been contorted with rage, was now slack with utter incomprehension. Julian Croft wasn't finished. He was energized, like he'd just unearthed a priceless artifact. That man, he boomed, his voice resonating with the weight of history, is the lead architect of the Helios operating system. He's a ghost, a legend. People in my generation talk about him the way physicists talk about Newton. Without the foundation Art Donovan built, the personal computer revolution would have been set back a decade. Without his elegant, minimalist code, the user-friendly interfaces we take for granted wouldn't exist. Without him, Croft's voice dropped, full of a deep, personal conviction. None of us would be here today. The story was so unbelievable, so completely at odds with the pathetic scene they had just witnessed, that the crowd was held in a state of suspended disbelief. Kyle was pale, ghostly white, staring at me as if my face were dissolving and rearranging itself into someone else's. The father he had spent a lifetime dismissing, the quiet, simple woodworker he had just publicly destroyed, was being described as a foundational pillar of his own universe. The cognitive dissonance was so violent it left him speechless. I was a junior programmer at Microtel when Helios was released, Croft continued, his voice now filled with a warm nostalgia, a story he was telling as much for himself as for the crowd. It was more than an OS. It was a philosophy. It taught a whole generation of us how to think. Art Donovan didn't just write code, he wrote poetry in machine language. And then, at the absolute height of his influence, after his company was acquired for a fortune, he just vanished. Walked away from it all. No interviews, no victory lap. He just disappeared. Croft looked back at my image on the screen, his expression a mixture of awe and profound sadness. He walked away from a world that would have made him a billionaire, and I never understood why. But I can see now he had his reasons. The camera in the lounge slowly panned from my stunned, dripping face to my son's horrified, catatonic one. The entire story was told in that one silent camera move. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been inverted with the force of a tectonic plate. I was no longer the victim. Kyle was no longer the accuser. He was the fool, the ignorant child who, in a fit of pique, had just taken a can of paint to the Mona Lisa in front of the entire art world. Julian Croft looked directly into the main stage camera, his gaze boring through the lens as if to speak directly to me. His voice was firm, a command that echoed with the weight of his legendary status. "Someone get a microphone to Mr. Donovan," he declared. "This summit has just found its real keynote speaker." And with that, the room exploded. It wasn't laughter. It was a deafening, thunderous, rolling wave of applause. It washed over me. A sound of respect so profound it felt like a physical force, washing away the sticky shame of the energy drink, washing away the laughter, washing away a lifetime of being underestimated by my own son. The wave of applause was a physical thing, a current of respect and awe so powerful it seemed to hold me upright. An event staffer, a young woman with wide, star-struck eyes, rushed over and handed me a wireless microphone as if it were a sacred object. My hand, still sticky from the energy drink, closed around it. The applause slowly began to subside as I raised it to my lips, the entire, massive auditorium waiting in breathless silence. I looked out at the sea of faces, and then my eyes found Kyle. He was still frozen, his face a canvas of utter devastation, finally seeing me, truly seeing me for the first time in his life. "Well," I began, my voice steady, carrying across the vast hall. A small, wry smile touched my lips. "This is not how I expected to spend my Saturday." A ripple of appreciative, tension-breaking laughter went through the crowd. "For those of you still wondering," I continued, my voice gaining strength, Yes, my name is Art Donovan, and a very long time ago, in a world that looked a lot different than this one, I was the lead architect for the Helios operating system. The applause started to swell again, but I held up a hand to gently quiet it. This moment wasn't about my past accomplishments. It was about the present. Julian Croft said he never understood why I walked away, I said, looking in the direction of the stage where Julian stood watching, rapt. The reason was simple. I went home from the office one night after a 70-hour work week, and my 3-year-old son didn't recognize me. He hid behind his mother's legs. In that moment, I realized I was building a world on a screen, and completely failing to build a life in my own home. So I chose. I chose my son. I chose to be a father instead of a pioneer, and I have never, not for a single second, regretted that choice. My gaze shifted, falling fully on Kyle. He flinched, as if my words were a physical touch. I turned my attention back to the crowd of innovators and entrepreneurs. You are all here today to talk about building the future. You talk about capital, code, and scalability. But sitting in your breakout sessions, you seem to have forgotten the most important component in any successful system: character. True innovation isn't about the valuation of your company. It's about the value of your word. It's not about disrupting markets. It's about refusing to disrupt the lives of the people who believe in you. It's not about your burn rate. My voice grew thick with emotion. It's about not burning the bridges that got you to where you are. Finally, I turned to face my son. The crowd, the cameras, the entire world seemed to fade away until it was just the two of us, standing in the wreckage of his ambition. My voice softened, no longer a speech for the masses, but the quiet, pained words of a father. "Kyle," I said, and his name was a heavy thing on my tongue. "You stood here, and you told me I had a legacy of nothing. You were wrong." I took a step closer to him, the microphone held loosely at my side. "My legacy is you. My legacy was supposed to be a man who understood that integrity is worth more than any stock option. You came to me today for an investment, for my signature on a loan. You thought the most valuable thing I could give you was my credit score." I had to pause, my own tears threatening to betray me. "The greatest investment I ever made in my life was the 35 years I poured into you. My time, my guidance, my unconditional love. That was my seed money. That was my capital. I am just so sorry that you built a whole company, but you never learned how to calculate the return on that." That was the blow that finally, completely shattered him. A choked sob escaped his lips. The tears that had been welling in his eyes streamed down his face, and he didn't even bother to wipe them away. "Dad," he whispered, his voice broken, a child's voice. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I put my hand on his shoulder, a gesture of forgiveness, of beginning again. I turned back to the silent, watching crowd one last time. "Build good things," I said into the microphone. "But more importantly, be good people." I set the microphone down on the table. The applause that followed was different. It was deep, heartfelt, and it was for the father, not the programmer. As it washed over us, I leaned in close to my son, my arm still on his shoulder, shielding him from the thousands of watching eyes. "Let's go home," I said. He just nodded, unable to speak, and let me guide him out of the lounge. We walked away from the lights, from the cameras, from the ruins of his spectacular public failure and my unexpected public vindication. We walked away from the world of glass and steel, two broken men, a father and his humbled son, taking the first, fragile step on the long road back to each other.